If a hostile nation, if they hack the United States power grid, that is unequivocally treated as an act of cyber war.
Right.
But
Absolutely.
if they hack a U.S. commercial satellite one that's providing, vital GPS coordinates to the military, or even timing signals to the financial sector, well, legally speaking, our government is still sort of arguing over whose jurisdiction that actually is.
Yeah, it's a massive gray area.
And while that argument was happening, on March 10th of this year, a huge, totally invisible clock just ran out on the entire American space industry.
It really did. And the silence around that date, it was kind of deafening.
Yeah.
I mean, there were no rockets launching to mark the occasion, no astronauts giving press conferences. It was simply this hard deadline where all the legacy commercial space licenses in the U.S. just officially expired.
Wow, all of them.
Every single one. So overnight, the entire industry was abruptly forced into this brand new, highly contested regulatory framework.
Okay, let's unpack this because I think it highlights something so crucial for you listening right now. The modern space race, it isn't just about, building better engines or lighter materials anymore.
Not at all.
It is quite literally about fixing the red tape on the launch pad. So that brings us to the mission for today's deep dive. We are exploring a comprehensive policy report from March 2026, and it's put together by Arsenal Government and Public Affairs.
Right, titled The Legislative Triad.
Exactly. So we're going to act as your guides today through these hidden bureaucratic gears that are quietly making or breaking the new space age. We want to extract those key aha moments for you without getting bogged down in all the legal jargon.
And what's really fascinating here is how the report frames this whole crisis. They introduce this concept of the legislative triad, which is essentially 3 distinct bills currently moving through Congress.
3 bills. Got it.
Right. And they're designed to fix this completely fractured, outdated U.S. regulatory system that is, well, frankly, it's actively choking the explosive growth we're seeing in commercial space.
Yeah. So what are the bills exactly?
We're looking at the Space Infrastructure Act, the Alien-CH Act, and the New Space Age Act. And they tackle 3 really fundamental pillars. So how we protect our satellites, how we actually get them off the ground, and who inside the government is actually in charge of overseeing all of it.
Okay, well, let's start with the foundation then, because before we can even dream about expanding our footprint in space, we have to talk about protecting the critical systems that are already floating above us, right?
Exactly. You have to secure what's there first.
Which brings us to the first bill in the Triad, the Space Infrastructure Act, or H.R. 1154. This bill basically wants to direct the Department of Homeland Security, the DHS, to designate space systems as a critical infrastructure sector.
Yes.
Because the U.S. currently has 16 of these sectors, right? Things like energy, the financial sector, transportation, and this bill would just make space the 17th.
That's the goal. And the why behind this push is entirely driven by the modern threat environment. I mean, this Cyberspace Solarium Commission 2.0 pushed really heavily for this designation because our current cross-sector defense, it's just failing.
It's just not keeping up.
Right. State-sponsored cyber threats, specifically from places like China and Russia, they are evolving so much faster than commercial operators can adapt on their own. The report actually points to the February 2022 Viasat hack as the major catalyst here.
Oh, man, I remember reading about the Viasat incident, but when you look at the actual mechanics of it, it is terrifying.
It really is a wake-up call.
Because the Russian hackers, they didn't launch a missile or even, touch the actual KASC satellite in orbit.
Nope, they didn't have to.
They targeted the ground network right at the start of the Ukraine invasion. Basically, they sent a malicious firmware update to the ground-based modems, and it essentially overwrote the flash memory of these devices.
Completely wiped them.
Yeah. It instantly turned tens of thousands of physical routers across Europe into just expensive plastic paperweights. It knocked out satellite internet for massive swaths of the continent in an instant.
And that event, it just completely proved that space is not some untouchable sanctuary. It is this highly vulnerable, deeply interconnected network.
Right.
So by making space the 17th critical infrastructure sector, the proponents argue that it forces the government to institutionalize its focus. It would actually create a dedicated space systems sector coordinating council.
Okay, so a dedicated group.
Yeah, but more importantly for the industry itself, it unlocks DHS critical infrastructure grants.
Which means real money for vulnerable targets down here on the ground.
Exactly.
Because the report highlights companies that are clustered in states like Arizona, So you've got Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, Honeywell. These facilities are building the hardware for missile defense, and they process super sensitive satellite data.
Right. They're huge targets.
So under this bill, they'd become eligible for federal funds to harden their cybersecurity infrastructure against those exact types of, modem bricking attacks we saw with Viasat.
They would. However, the report also outlines, very neutrally I should add, the severe pushback this bill is facing.
Oh, really? Who is pushing back on securing space?
Well, critics, notably the Heritage Foundation, they are sounding the alarm about what they call mandate creep.
Mandate creep.
Right. They argue that adding a 17th sector simply dilutes an already stretched DHS budget. I mean, the core of their argument is basically, if you make everything a top national priority, then nothing is actually a priority.
Okay, I can see that. I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of, a startup building satellite components.
Yeah.
If we give space this fortress designation, aren't we just handing commercial satellite operators a massive new pile of compliance paperwork?
That is exactly the fear.
Because it sounds like we might just be replacing physical vulnerabilities with bureaucratic ones?
This raises an important question, right? Because designation almost always precedes heavy regulation. The critics point to a recent law. It's known as CIRCIA.
CIRCIA, what does that stand for?
It's the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act.
Okay.
And under CIRCIA, critical infrastructure entities are legally required to report any significant cyber incidents to the government within 72 hours.
Oh, wow. Just 3 days?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if space becomes the 17th sector, commercial operators could suddenly find themselves swept up in these massive security audits, rapid reporting requirements, and huge compliance costs. Things that, frankly, smaller startups simply cannot afford.
Right. They don't have the legal teams for that. And the report actually points out this glaring ambiguity in the bill's language, too. It directs the DHS to define the scope of the sector.
Yes. Scope.
What does that actually mean in practice? Is a space system just the billion-dollar satellite in orbit, or is it the telemetry ground station?
Exactly. Where does it end?
Right. What about the user terminal sitting on my roof? Or the cloud computing network processing all the geographic data? If I manufacture specialized screws for a rocket engine assembly line, am I suddenly critical infrastructure subject to a 72-hour cyber reporting mandate?
And that ambiguity is the precise reason the industry is so nervous. Because the definition of that scope determines who gets hit with the regulatory hammer. Drawing a neat box around what constitutes space technology in 2026, it's virtually impossible. Space data is integrated into almost every terrestrial industry now.
So if we agree that a single hack can wipe out satellite internet across Europe, securing these networks sounds like a no-brainer, even with the compliance headaches. But, securing the satellites assumes we can actually get them up there in the first place.
Right, which is becoming a huge problem.
Which leads us directly into the operational bottleneck and the second piece of the Legislative Triad, the Law and H Act, or H.R. 5602.
This is where the industry is feeling the most acute pain right now. The LANCH Act is aimed squarely at the Federal Aviation Administration's Office of Commercial Space Transportation, the AST.
Okay.
Specifically, it's targeting the fallout from Part 450, which is that notorious licensing regulation that triggered that March 10th deadline we mentioned right at the start.
Okay, so I am genuinely struggling to understand the bottleneck here, because the report says Part 450 was supposed to be a massive streamlining effort.
That was the original intention, yes.
Because under the old rules, the FAA used a strict prescriptive checklist. You check the boxes for your specific rocket, they pass. Why did they abandon a simple checklist for whatever this highly subjective Part 450 process is? I mean, a checklist sounds infinitely faster.
Well, checklists are faster if you're launching the exact same expendable rocket every single time, which is basically how the industry operated for decades. But then, companies started landing rockets backward on drone ships, and they started 3D printing engines and building reusable space planes. The old checklists just couldn't account for new technology. They were actively stifling innovation.
Oh, I see.
So the FAA introduced Part 450 as a performance-based rule. Instead of telling a company, hey, use a 3-inch steel valve, the FAA essentially says, we don't care what kind of valve you use, just prove to us mathematically that your fuel system won't leak under launch pressure.
Ah, okay. So under the old rules, it was a simple multiple choice test.
Basically.
Now, under Part 450, it's basically like a teacher swapping that multiple choice test for a highly subjective engineering essay.
That is a brilliant way to put it.
Instead of looking for a standard correct answer, The FAA reviewer has to independently verify thousands of pages of unique proprietary physics and math for every single applicant. No wonder they are overwhelmed.
That analogy perfectly captures the crisis, because performance-based regulation, it requires an enormous amount of subjective judgment and deep technical analysis from the federal reviewer.
Right.
And when you combine that required depth with a severely understaffed FAA office, the system just completely grinds to a halt.
And the statistics in the report are just staggering. By June of 2025, the FAA had only managed to issue 8 licenses under Part 450, 8 total.
It's wild.
And 2 of those blew right past the 180-day statutory limit for a review. And here is the detail that really illustrates the gridlock for me. SpaceX alone is eating up roughly 80% of the overtime hours for the FAA's commercial space office.
Yeah, that stat is incredible.
You have companies spending months, sometimes years, in these pre-application consultations, just trying to guess what the FAA wants to see in their engineering essay before the official 180-day review clock even starts.
So the Allianz CH Act attacks this essay grading bottleneck from a few distinct angles.
Okay, what do they propose?
First, it forces transparency by mandating a public digital dashboard.
Right.
Think of it as a regulatory shot clock. It shows exactly where an application is, which specific official is reviewing it, and how much time has elapsed.
Oh, that's smart. Accountability.
Exactly. Second, it requires the assignment of dedicated team leads to each applicant. That way, companies stop getting bounced around between different departments.
That makes sense.
And third, it gives the Department of Transportation direct hire authority, so they can quickly bypass standard federal hiring delays and just bring in specialized aerospace engineers.
But the most controversial part of the Launch-CH Act, right, is the shift in the legal burden of proof. Because the bill forces the FAA to accept a reasonable safety rationale proposed by the applicant.
Yes, that is a profound shift in regulatory culture. The bill essentially tells FAO reviewers to stop defaulting to their own preferred engineering methodologies.
Right.
If the private company's safety rationale is fundamentally reasonable, the FAA just has to accept it and move on.
I mean, I can absolutely see why the industry is lobbying hard for that. But I can also hear safety advocates screaming from a mile away.
Oh, definitely.
Because you are legally instructing federal regulators to lower the friction of approval for, essentially, controlled explosions flying over populated areas.
The tension there is very, very real. Safety advocates argue this chips away at the FAA's independent oversight. But the industry counters that without this philosophical shift, the American launch cadence will just flatline entirely. We'll fall behind.
Which brings us to the third piece. Because if Part 450 is just a symptom of a larger problem, we have to look at the third bill.
Right.
The root cause of this gridlock isn't just a badly written subjective rule. It's a structural misalignment of the agency itself. Enter the new Space Age Act, H.R. 1E320.
This bill represents the real institutional battle. The new Space Age Act, and this overlaps with some provisions in the Launch Act, actually, it proposes a total bureaucratic divorce. Yes. It seeks to rip the Commercial Space Office, the AST, out of the FAA entirely. It would elevate it to become a standalone entity called the Commercial Space Transportation Administration, and they would report directly to the Secretary of Transportation.
Which makes sense because right now the AST is just this tiny office buried deep inside the massive machinery of the FAA. And let's remember what the FAA's actual primary job is. They oversee a $1.7 trillion aviation industry with roughly 45,000 daily commercial flights.
Exactly. Their plate is full.
Trying to run a cutting-edge commercial space program from deep inside the FAA is like trying to coordinate a manned mission to Mars from the same desk that approves local zoning permits for a new bus stop.
That's a great visual.
You are constantly competing for attention and budget in a building that ultimately just wants to make sure passenger airliners don't crash.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, that structural mismatch explains the severe talent drain they're seeing. The report notes that in May of 2025, the AST had acting officials filling almost all of its senior positions. The GIS temps? Right, it simply couldn't attract or retain permanent leadership.
Yeah.
The aviation side of the FAA naturally, and honestly necessarily, swallows the bandwidth of the agency's leadership.
Yeah.
Elevating commercial space to its own standalone administration, with a presidentially appointed administrator, gives it independent budget authority. It essentially puts space on equal footing with highways, railroads, and aviation within the Department of Transportation.
But moving out of the house is always messy. A bureaucratic divorce of this magnitude creates massive transition disruptions, particularly around airspace
This
closures.
is the tricky part.
Because a rocket launch is, at its core, a controlled explosion piercing straight through commercial flight paths. Right now, to keep airliners safe, the FAA's Air Traffic Organization, the ATO, closes that airspace.
Hmm.
And because the Space Office and the Air Traffic Office are both inside the FAA, it's just an internal process. They share a boss.
And that is the most operationally critical friction point of this proposed divorce. If you rip the space regulators out and make them a separate administration, closing the airspace is no longer just an internal memo.
It becomes a whole thing.
It becomes a formal interagency negotiation. The new space administration would have to formally request the FAA to shut down incredibly lucrative commercial flight paths for every single launch window.
Wow.
Yeah, and if that new interagency relationship becomes adversarial or even just bogged down in new procedural paperwork, launch delays could actually get much worse before they get better. Congress hesitated to pull the trigger on this during the 2024 FAA reauthorization, but the industry pressure is just reaching a boiling point now.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. We've spent all this time focused on the triad. So protecting the satellites, streamlining the launch licenses, and reorganizing the agencies. But the report points out a massive glaring blind spot, the mission authorization gap.
Yes, this is a huge issue.
None of these three bills actually cover what happens when companies start doing completely novel things once they are actually up in orbit.
It is a fascinating regulatory vacuum. Because in the U.S., if you want to launch a rocket, the FAA handles it. If your satellite needs to transmit radio frequencies, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, licenses the spectrum.
Right.
And if you want to take high-resolution pictures of Earth, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, has to approve your cameras.
Okay, so it's all piecemeal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what if a startup wants to build a pharmaceutical factory in microgravity, or send up a tow truck satellite to grab space debris, or mine a near-Earth asteroid? Under current U.S. law, there is no single agency with the statutory authority to give you permission to do those things.
So what happens? Do the companies just launch anyway and see what happens?
Well, nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the federal government. Because Congress hasn't passed a law explicitly assigning this jurisdiction yet, the executive branch just stepped in. Currently, Executive Order 14335 is giving the Office of Space Commerce the power to authorize these novel activities.
How are they doing that without a law?
They're using what they call light touch commitments. The framework essentially asks companies to promise they will protect national security and not cause international incidents. And in return, the government gives them a tentative green light.
Which ties directly into orbital debris, actually a topic the report highlights as an escalating existential nightmare.
It's getting so crowded up there.
Space is rapidly filling up with dead satellites and shrapnel just flying around at 17,000 miles per hour. You have the FCC unilaterally demanding that satellites deorbit within 5 years of their mission ending.
Right.
Then you have a proposed collision avoidance system called Track CSS.
Track CSS, the Traffic Coordination System for Space. It is essentially an automated air traffic control system for orbit. It ingests radar data, calculates potential orbital collisions, and sends automated warnings to satellite operators.
Just telling them exactly when to fire their thrusters to dodge incoming debris?
Yes, but the report notes TRAS CSS is constantly fighting for its own budget survival. The governance of orbital debris right now is a fractured multi-agency mess.
And there is a massive geopolitical ticking clock behind all of this domestic confusion.
You absolutely cannot look at the legislative triad in a vacuum. Everything we have discussed today is being violently accelerated by the strategic competition between the U.S. and China.
Right. The China Artemis timeline. China has explicitly and publicly stated they are landing astronauts on the moon by 2030, with plans to build a permanent lunar base at the South Pole.
Which is coming up incredibly fast.
Meanwhile, the U.S. Artemis program, which shares the exact same goal, has been hit with delay after delay. And it's not just lunar exploration at stake here. The report brings up the Golden Dome initiative. This is a roughly $23 billion missile defense system designed to counter next-generation hypersonic weapons.
And the mechanics of the Golden Dome are entirely dependent on commercial space. Hypersonic missiles, they fly too low and too fast to be tracked by traditional ground-based radar.
Right.
So to see them, the Golden Dome relies on a proliferated constellation. Basically, thousands of cheap, small commercial satellites in low Earth orbit, just constantly communicating and tracking heat signatures from above.
But satellites in low orbit degrade quickly, right? They eventually fall back to Earth.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
maintaining that missile shield requires constant weekly rocket launches to replenish the dead sensors.
And how do those sensors get to space? They launch on commercial rockets built by companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin. So if the FAA analyst is bogged down grading an engineering essay and cannot issue a Part 450 launch license, those rockets stay on the ground. And if they stay on the ground, the Golden Dome's constellation degrades and fails. Artemis is delayed. The entire U.S. strategic and military posture is literally constrained by the speed of administrative paperwork.
Furthermore, aerospace capital is highly mobile. If the U.S. regulatory apparatus cannot keep pace with the engineering, these emerging, heavily funded space companies have options.
Right, they don't have to stay here.
Exactly. What prevents a startup from taking its proprietary technology, its engineering jobs, and its tax revenue to a foreign jurisdiction with friendlier, faster rules? If the U.S. squeezes them too hard with mandate creep and delayed licenses, we don't just lose an economic boom, we lose sovereign control over the foundational technologies of the 21st century.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? If you are wondering why you should care about a backlog and FAA paperwork, just think about your cell phone. The GPS you use to navigate traffic, the precise timing signals that process your credit card swipe at the grocery store, the weather forecast that tells you a storm is coming.
It's all connected.
It all relies on a steady, uninterrupted stream of new satellites replacing old ones. If the launch pad is frozen by red tape, your daily life down here starts to visibly degrade. The Legislative Triad, the Space Infrastructure Act, the Launch Act, and the new Space Age Act, these are not just dry policy documents debated in committee rooms. They are the scaffolding of our future space economy.
Well said.
And right now, the brutal fight to build that scaffolding is happening squarely in the halls of Congress and the Department of Transportation.
And to leave you with one final thought to mull over, we have spent this entire deep dive unpacking how painfully difficult it is just to legally get a rocket off the ground in 2026 or to designate a basic satellite as critical infrastructure.
Yeah.
It requires 3 massive bills, a total restructuring of federal agencies, and intense political warfare just to manage the space immediately surrounding Earth. But we are rapidly approaching an era of deep space habitats and lunar resource extraction.
It's happening.
Right. So if our Earth-bound legal systems are currently buckling under the simple weight of launch licenses, how will they possibly handle the complexities of property rights or even criminal jurisdiction inside a permanent, privately owned commercial colony on the moon?
That is a completely wild thought. If we can't figure out the paperwork to launch a rocket, how do we handle a property dispute or a crime on a lunar base? We are actively trying to write the rules for the 22nd century using the clunky bureaucratic tools of the 20th. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking up and definitely keep looking at the fine print.